CEO salaries are going through the roof, and it's uncorrelated with performance. It's another interesting aspect of it. There have been now studies of it, so it's just some other thing. It has nothing to do with markets or anything else. And meanwhile, wages continue to decline, as does family income and so on. Well, nobody who even looks at the business press can believe that there are lean and mean times. As I said, the country is just awash with capital. Their problem is they don't know what to do with it, so therefore get more. Another theme that's around now is you have to have what's called downsizing in order to be competitive. Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics came out with its figures up to last year. They have them for it, 1993. From 1983 to 1993, the category of executives, managers, and administrative personnel grew 30%. Okay, that's downsizing. The fastest growing white-collar population happens to be security guard. Well, yeah, that's connected with turning it into a third world country. You take a walk down San Salvador, you'll see plenty of security guards. Rich people have to be protected. And furthermore, all these prisons you're throwing people into, they need security guards. So yeah, they're administrative personnel, and that's increasing, but so are same in corporations. There's no downsizing going on, except for working people. That's quite different. Why is it happening now? Anyway, let's go back to why it's happening now. Well, the fact is it's always going on, just depending on the weapons at hand. American business particularly, is highly class conscious and very open about it, incidentally. And it's always fighting a bitter class war. You go back a century ago into what were called the gay 90s, when incidentally the international economy was about the international economy was pretty much as like it is now in terms of capital flows and so on. It hasn't become more globalized in terms of trade and capital flow and so on than it was then, may even be less so. About a century ago, it looked as if the game was over. They were talking about the end of history, perfection had been reached, in the devil will take the hindmost society where everybody's for themselves and enrich yourselves and so on. It was monstrous for working people, very brutal, in fact, here. That was a century ago. Well, didn't end. In Europe particularly, the social contract was slowly imposed, not easily. It didn't happen here. By the Roaring Twenties, as they were called, labor had no voice. This is the age of mass production and automobiles and so on. Labor was out of it. It was a business-run society almost completely, and it looked permanent. Again, utopia of the masters, end of history, all this talk. The 1930s, it proved to be wrong. There was a lot of popular organizing, popular protest. It rammed through elements of the social contract that had been achieved in Europe decades earlier, and that just caused hysteria in the business community. You read the business press, it was talking about the hazard facing manufacturers and the rising political power of the masses and how we're going to face disaster unless we figure out some way to reverse this and control their minds and control them and so on. A huge propaganda campaign began right after the Wagner Act was passed, 1935. In the next 2 years, the National Association of Manufacturers, its public relations budget multiplied by a factor of 20, as they recognized that force alone is not going to be enough. The U.S. has a very violent labor history and plenty of workers were getting killed, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be enough. They had to have huge propaganda. It was sort of put on, that's when all this harmony business that I was talking about got designed. It was a specific design as to how to carry out what they called scientific methods of strike breaking by controlling communities and so on. Well, it was put on hold during the war, and then it picked up right after the Second World War was over with an enormous propaganda campaign. I mean, you can't believe the scale until you look at it. And the purpose was very explicit. The purpose was to win the everlasting battle for the minds of men, which have to be indoctrinated with the capitalist story as we sell our preferred way of life, and on and on. These are all just quotes from mainstream PR literature. And it was very substantial and aimed precisely at what I described. They describe what they're doing, and you can see it in the propaganda, the schools, the entertainment industry, everything else. Well, what happened in the 1970s? But what happened is there were some changes in the international economy and in technology and so on, which just put new weapons into the hands of the masters. One crucial factor, which everyone points to, is an enormous growth in financial capital, financial transactions. It just boomed, short-range financial transactions. That came about partly because of the dismantling of the post-war Bretton Woods system of regulated currencies, which kind of made currencies free-floating. The Nixon administration just dismantled it. Partly it came about for technical reasons. I mean, the telecommunications revolution, which was, of course, publicly subsidized, at that point made it possible to transfer funds very rapidly. So like you can, by now it's estimated around $1 trillion a day, just shift up and back from one market to another, very short-term transactions, all and at and aimed at something. They're all aimed at low growth and high profits and low wages. And that is a factor that's driving policy in that direction. I don't think it's by any means an uncontrollable factor, but it's definitely a factor. And that's just put a lot, and the changes are in the composition of capital transactions are very striking. From about maybe the time when you have data, like late 19th century up till about 1970, rough estimate was that about 90% of capital transfers had to do with the real economy, with investment and trade, 10% speculation. By 1990, the figures had reversed. By 1995, the latest UNCTAD, UN Economic Commission estimate was about 5% real economy, 95% speculation, short-term speculation like against currencies, which is essentially aimed at driving down growth and increasing profits and lowering wages. This was understood very quickly by the late 70s, and there were proposals made, for example, by James Tobin, the Yale economist, Nobel Prize winner at an American Economic Association presidential address, 1978, simply suggested a simple reform: low tax, very low tax on short-term financial transactions, just to slow it down, throw a little sand in the gears. Probably work. It's been called the Tobin tax, but it's not getting anywhere because the weapon is a very important one. That weapon has been used very efficiently for all the purposes that have been described, and there are other things. Is it out of control? Is there nothing we can do? Well, there's no reason to believe that. I mean, elementary reforms, like, say, the Tobin tax, could have maybe a big effect. Furthermore, more globally, all of these interchanges, as I mentioned, the international economy is not more integrated by most measures than it was 100 years ago, in fact, less in many respects. And the transactions that are going on are mostly within the big three regions: United States, Japan, and Europe. Now that's under political control. That's not out of political control. Democratic societies in these three areas could control this. The idea that it's somehow, kind of impossible to control all over the world, that's just not true. You look at the flows, they're internal to the highly developed, rich societies, where theoretically there are democratic governments and could impose all sorts of restrictions. Furthermore, all the talk about corporate greed and everything is really crucially beside the point, in my point of view, I think, and should be recognized as a very big regression from what working people and a lot of others understood very well a century ago. Talk about corporate greed is nonsense. Corporations are greedy by their nature. There's no such, they're nothing else. They're instruments for interfering with markets to maximize profit and wealth and market control. You can't make them more or less greedy. I mean, maybe you can sort of force them to be. It's like taking a totalitarian state and saying be less brutal. Well, yeah, maybe you can get a totalitarian state to be less brutal, but that's not the point. The point is not to get a tyranny to be less brutal, but to get rid of it. Now, like 150 years ago, that was understood. I mean, if you read the labor press, there was a very lively labor press right around here, Lowell and Lawrence and places like that around the mid-19th century, run by artisans and what they call factory girls, young women from farms who were working there. And they weren't asking the autocracy to be less brutal. They were saying, get rid of it. And in fact, that makes perfect sense. These are human institutions. There's nothing graven in stone about them. They're created early in this century with their present powers. They come from the same intellectual roots as the other modern forms of totalitarianism, namely Stalinism and fascism, and they have no more legitimacy than they do. So it's not a, I mean, yeah, let's try and make the autocracy less brutal if that's the short-term possibility, but we should have the sophistication of, say, factory girls in Lowell 150 years ago, and recognize that this is just degrading and intolerable, and that, as they put it, those who work in the mills should own them, and on to everything else, and that's democracy. You don't have that, you don't have democracy. Okay.